Stephen Zunes is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, where he serves as coordinator of the Middle East Studies program. He is a member of the Quaker Palestine-Israel Network and has served as a staff member, committee member, and volunteer on Middle East concerns for the AFSC, Friends General Conference, and Philadelphia yearly meeting. Our next presenter will be David Hostetter, whose paper is entitled Anatomy of Truth, Speak Truth to Power, Anatomy of Anti-Communism, and AFSC Strategy to Thaw the Cold War. David Hostetter is an independent scholar and the author of Movement Matters, American Anti-Apartheid Activism and the Rise of Multicultural Politics, which includes a chapter on AFSC's anti-apartheid work. He is a 1979 graduate of George School, and he served on the staff of the Washington Peace Center from 1985 to 1988. And he also works with the Peace History Society. And finally, Negar Razavi, I always get this wrong. Negar is a friend of mine, and I every single time mispronounce her name. Anyway, Negar is going to present a paper entitled From Feminist Security Experts to Human Rights Lobbyists, Middle East Policy and the Politics of Resistance Within the Washington Establishment. Negar is an advanced doctoral candidate in anthropology at Penn. Her dissertation evaluates the role of Washington, D.C.-based policy experts in shaping U.S. security policies towards the Middle East since 2001. She previously worked at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Education for Employment Foundation, and she has an MSc from Oxford and a BA from Tufts University. So without further ado, I would invite Stephen Zunes to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks to everyone who helped make this amazing celebration possible. And a personal thank you to a number of friends and mentors here in the audience who, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here in a number of capacities. So it's such an honor to be here. You know, there's a lot that one can be said about the oppressive history of the AFSC's work in the Middle East, as well as its current priorities, but some of those have been touched upon already, and they'll be done so in more detail in the workshops tomorrow. My involvement with AFSC Middle East peace work, which stretched from the mid-70s through the mid-90s, was primarily that as a volunteer and committee member in what was then referred to as peace education. The then dominant approach that AFSC took to the conflict at that time was to encourage dialogue between Jews and Arabs. Recognizing it as a conflict between two historically oppressed peoples, it was understood that peace and reconciliation required hearing each other's stories and perspectives. And on one hand, that seems quite reasonable, but I was one of those who also believed it was important to recognize the gross asymmetry in power in that point of history between Israelis and Palestinians. One group was living under foreign belligerent occupation, and the other was the occupier. And our government was largely responsible for making that possible. There was a palpable tension during that period between Philadelphia and the regional offices over a number of issues, which often boiled down to the question of how much overt advocacy the AFSC should engage in pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, specifically regarding how much should U.S. and Israeli policies be explicitly challenged. Indeed, when I was one of the 3 finalists for the AFSC Middle East Peace Education secretary position here in Philadelphia in 1994. I was interviewed by phone by the half-dozen regional staff, then focusing on Israel and Palestine. And a recurring theme in the course of the interview was along the lines of, will you have our backs in our disputes with the board? Last year, I was invited to Pendle Hill to take part in a joint meeting of the AFSC and the Quaker Palestine-Israel Network. And having long been accustomed to being seen in Quaker circles as one of the more strident pro-Palestinian voices, I was surprised to find myself as one of the more moderate voices in the room. My perspective had not changed fundamentally, yet during my 20 years as an academic out in California, there had been a discernible shift in the dominant discourse in the AFSC towards a more explicit pro-Palestinian activism. Now, this shift is quite understandable in many respects, given the dramatic shift to the right in Israeli policies and U.S. support for those policies, but it has had its consequences in placing the AFSC under extreme pressure. And among the issues that have made AFSC a target of such criticism has been the issue of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. Now, let's remember that these are tactics, not an organization. There has been a formal call for a comprehensive BDS by Palestinian civil society organizations, which makes little distinction between the occupied territories and Israel itself, and calls for the continuation of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions until Israel grants complete equality for Palestinians, including the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants, which would mean Jews would no longer be the majority of the Israeli population. And this is what's led some to accuse those who advocate BDS, including the AFSC, of wanting to destroy Israel. Let's recall, though, that the AFSC supports the use of boycotts and divestment campaigns targeting only countries that support the occupation, settlement, militarism, or other violations of international humanitarian or human rights law. They do not call for the full boycott of Israel, nor of companies because they are either Israelis or doing business in Israel, nor do the actions focus on individuals. But even going this far constitutes a much bolder stance than the AFSC has taken historically on Israel-Palestine. But it's not a radical departure for AFSC overall. My first volunteer effort with AFSC was at age 19 here in Philadelphia in support of boycott, divestments, and sanctions in relation to the occupation of Namibia by apartheid South Africa. Indeed, boycotts, of course, have been used by Quakers for centuries, such as the refusal to buy products produced by slaves. More recent examples have included the boycott of non-union lettuce and grapes in support of California farm workers, and the boycott of certain brands of coffee connected to supporters of El Salvador's death squads. Nevertheless, the AFSC's decision to support boycotts and divestment as a nonviolent means of opposing the Israeli occupation has led to strong opposition, even from within some Quaker circles. For example, for a number of years, lower school students at Friend Central had put on a concert which raised money for the AFSC. This was a tiny amount of cash raised by the young peoples themselves, last year totaling roughly $28. But yet, however, the Friend Central administration decided, due to AFSC's partial BDS endorsement, that the money had to go to a non-Quaker charity instead. They never asked the pupils if they wanted to change the recipient of their fundraising efforts. Even though barely more than 1% of the AFSC's total budget is directed towards Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding work, and only a minority of that goes to support boycotts and divestments from the 4 or 5 companies, the Friend Central administration essentially decided to not allow their students to support AFSC because of that 0.3%, which would amount to roughly 12 cents. The decision to support such nonviolent methods for peace and justice as boycotting and divesting from companies has cost AFSC more than $28 from Friend Central pupils. A number of donors, including a family foundation which used to provide annual grants, no longer donate to AFSC because of it. And it's also run AFSC afoul with state governments. A number of states, such as New Jersey, which has worked with AFSC on immigration and other issues, may be forced to sever its ties due to a new law that forbids the state government from working with any organization which boycotts Israel, which is defined in the law to include companies in the occupied territories. In many respects, these attacks against AFSC are not new. As far back as the early 70s, the AFSC booklet Search for Peace in the Middle East, which is extraordinarily moderate and understated by today's standards, was subjected to vicious attack and misrepresentation. Indeed, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, even the most moderate position can get you into trouble. So a lot of this is going to happen regardless. Among the most effective efforts the AFSC has been to bring dissident Israeli voices, some who identified as Zionist and some who did not, to share their perspectives on how Israeli policies and U.S. support for such policies is not only harmful to Palestinians, but ultimately harmful to Israelis as well. This is very important as it underscores that this is not ultimately a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but between forces of militarism, racism, and national and/or religious chauvinism versus those of peace, justice, and reconciliation. Unfortunately, even that approach is unacceptable to some Quaker institutions. Just a couple years ago, Friends Academy on Long Island canceled a scheduled assembly, which was to be followed by a lunchtime dialogue with students, by two young Israeli conscience objectors, part of a speaking tour organized by the AFSC. The Quaker in residence at the school, AFSC General Secretary Shan Cretin and others, tried to convince the school administration to allow the COs to speak, but they steadfastly refused. Neither the head of the school at the time of the cancellation, the current head of the school, nor the chair of the board has been willing to explain to me, despite my repeated inquiries, as to why they canceled the presentations. One Jewish parent, a former Israeli, whose daughter was valedictorian this past year, suspected that anti-Semitism may have played a role, since non-Jewish conscience objectors have been allowed to speak at the school both before and after that incident. The Israelis were to talk about their leadings that led them to refuse military service, which would have included raising concerns about the brutal Israeli occupation. As a result, others have shared their opinion that rather than anti-Semitism, the Friends Academy administration may have been motivated by anti-Arab racism, apparently believing that the Israeli occupation is actually a good thing, that Palestinians should be forced to live under foreign military rule, that they do not have the right to their freedom, and students should therefore not be exposed to those who believe otherwise, even if they are Israelis. Whatever the reasons, it underscores how contentious AFSC Middle East peace-building work can be when a Quaker school bans conscience objectors. In fact, I would strongly recommend each of you to consider writing a thoughtful email to the head of school and the chair of the board of Friends Academy and encourage them to end this ban on Israeli COs. Again, it really just seems unreasonable. Another criticism that AFSC receives for its work on Israel-Palestine, including from many friends, is that they're not being balanced in their presentation, and that it's important to hear both sides of the issue. Some of the Palestinian speakers supported by the AFSC have come across as too strident and have made some friends uncomfortable. But when you think about it, for decades, AFSC has brought in people from conflict regions to tell their stories and perspectives which, due to the biases in Washington, mainstream media, and elsewhere, we did not normally get to hear. Some of these speakers from countries such as Vietnam, South Africa, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Namibia, elsewhere, took positions which at times made friends uncomfortable and even contradicted our understanding of the peace testimony and other forms of witness. Yet there are perspectives that were important to hear, even if we believe that they were wrong in some respects. In exposing people to witnesses from the Global South, Friends schools and organizations have largely understood this. They did not insist on balancing the perspective of a black South African anti-apartheid activist with a white South African pro-apartheid speaker, or a human rights activist from El Salvador with a supporter of the Salvadoran junta, or an East Timorese with a supporter of the Indonesian occupation. Why is it that we keep being told to ensure balance only if the speaker is a Palestinian or a supporter of Palestinian rights? Why must there be a special sensitivity when it comes to Israel? Why should Israel be treated differently than other US-backed right-wing governments engaging in oppressive policies? Well, some would argue that it's because it is indeed different. Not that Israeli policies are justifiable than those by any other repressive government, but that Israel is the world's only Jewish state. For example, if there's only one black state in the world, there'd be a lot of African Americans, along with many white liberals, who might be somewhat defensive about criticisms, even if completely justifiable. As with the specter of racism, which leaves many of us reticent to say things that might inadvertently encourage prejudice, there are those who feel obliged to show special sensitivity regarding anti-Semitism. There's an understandable desire to reassure our Jewish friends, neighbors, colleagues, and others that we are not unfairly singling out Israel and that our concerns about Israel and Palestine are consistent with our witness regarding violence and injustice everywhere. We indeed do need to exercise a special sensitivity on issues related to Israel. The question is to what extent is the AFSC required to show special sensitivity to right-wing militaristic political positions advocated by pro-Israeli national chauvinists? The fact is that as a result of internalized oppression or other reasons, there are some Jews, like those of other faith traditions or those of no faith tradition, who are more or less set in their ways, and all the listening and rewording and rescheduling is not going to change them. We should not hold back out of our fear of getting people upset with us, particularly since the growing numbers of American Jews also oppose the Israeli occupation and also support equal rights for Palestinians. And let's take responsibility for the choices of leaders of Quaker institutions. For example, some people have tried to explain the decisions by Friends Central and Friends Academy administrations against the AFSC and its programs because they were pressured by Jewish parents for whom they rely on financial contributions. I've seen no evidence to support this claim, however, and indeed I think such assumptions parallel ugly anti-Semitic stereotypes of blaming some kind of cabal of rich Jews behind the scenes, effectively scapegoating Jews for the decisions of non-Jewish administrators and board members. But even if there were threats by right-wing parents, supporters of the Israeli occupation, to withhold donations, the fact is that Quaker institutions have for years received financial pressure and other pressure because of our principled commitment to desegregation, peace in Vietnam and Central America, majority rule in South Africa, ending the arms race, supporting climate justice, labor rights, and more. Yet their administrations and boards have almost always stood up to principle. As a result, I believe the decision rests with the administrations and boards alone, and neither Jewish parents nor the AFSC should be blamed. I know that it's very difficult for many of us to be falsely accused of prejudice of any kind. We don't like being attacked by the media. We don't like losing donors. We don't like being yelled at. We must hold fast to principle, however. Within AFSC, I see that the Middle East program today is on solid ground. Though the continued expansion of illegal Israeli settlements has resulted in such dramatic demographic changes that a viable two-state solution may no longer be possible, the AFSC continues to affirm the right of both Israelis and Palestinians to live as sovereign peoples in their own homeland and is open to any equitable and reciprocal resolution. Restructuring and other initiatives has largely eliminated the tension in the earlier years and has resulted in better integration between the international program and peace-building projects, as well as those between foreign and domestic staff. Some important niches in relief work and peace-building are taking place in Gaza, Jerusalem, and elsewhere. Domestically, the AFSC, as it has for decades, has served to quietly work with other groups, providing space to encourage cooperation on shared concerns and building broad coalitions. Given that some groups involved with Palestine embrace some rather extreme ideologies or associations, the AFSC has had to practice a fair amount of discernment with what kind of coalitions and with which it is willing to work, and have had to make some tough but wise and principled decisions. The two major campaigns currently are No Way to Treat a Child, focusing on young Palestinians detained by Israeli occupation forces, and Gaza Unchained, working to lift the siege on that crowded, impoverished enclave where the AFSC launched one of its most impressive relief efforts back in 1948. I believe, however, that the AFSC can still do more to minimize criticism while still speaking truth to power. For example, Palestine is one of only 2 nations formally recognized by the United Nations as non-self-governing territories under foreign belligerent occupation. The other is Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara, which, like Palestine, has struggled under a brutal military occupation, illegal settlements, a separation wall, and an occupier which has routinely defied the United Nations, the World Court, and most of the international community. As with Palestine, Western Saharans have been calling for BDS to support their struggle for freedom, specifically a handful of foreign corporations which support the occupation. What if the AFSC, instead of calling for divestment specifically from companies supporting the Israeli occupation, the call was for a divestment from companies supporting all recognized foreign belligerent occupations, which only include the addition of Western Sahara? I think that would help by broadening this. I think it would protect the AFSC from spurious charges of anti-Semitism, and would also bring attention to a little-known but important self-determination struggle. The second thing I would emphasize is I believe there should be greater focus on the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The fact is there is no way that Israel would be able to maintain its occupation, repression, and colonization in the occupied territories, nor could it get away with the kind of war crimes it has committed in its periodic military operations in the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, and elsewhere, were it not for the unconditional military, financial, and diplomatic support of the United States. As citizens of the United States, American Quakers have far more power to influence our own government than we do foreign governments. Back in the 1980s, during the slaughter in El Salvador, we generally did not protest before the Salvadoran embassy. We protested at U.S. government buildings because we recognized that, as horrible as the Salvadoran junta may have been, they were only able to engage in the massacres and repression as a result of the U.S. support. Without the U.S. veto power in the United Nations, without the massive arms shipments and financial support, Israel would be subjected to international sanctions and other pressures which would long ago force them to end the occupation. Israel engages in the kind of repressive policies and violations of international responsibilities because it can. Any other country in a hostile region given such a blank check by the world's one remaining superpower would probably do the same kinds of things. And the refusal for the United States to apply pressure to end the colonization of the West Bank and the occupation is not just bad for Palestinians, but bad for Israelis. As Ron Young, who served both as AFSC Peace Education Secretary and AFSC Middle East representative, the United States is no more pro-Israel than it was pro-El Salvador, supporting the right-wing militaristic reactionary forces that are sowing seeds to the country's destruction. Unfortunately, an Israel at peace would, with its neighbors, be far less likely to be willing to serve as a reliable ally in support of U.S. hegemonic designs in this critical region. As a result, again, we need to emphasize that this is not about Israel versus Palestine, but the United States versus peace and security for both peoples. That the United States may be anti-Palestinian, but it is not pro-Israeli. That the problem is not Israel, but U.S. support for the most right-wing militaristic elements in Israel, which Washington has helped come to power and sustain. There's a lot more I can say, but I'm out of time. But what I think what this underlines is that there is no inherent contradiction between advocacy and reconciliation. In order to effectively address Israel-Palestine, one needs nuance, reflection, discernment, empathy, a willingness to listen, and an ability to keep a global perspective while prioritizing the responsibilities of our own government. This isn't easy, and yet all these are the very things that Quakers are particularly good at. As a result, despite how messy and complicated and problematic our efforts have been on this issue over the years, I do believe that the AFSC has a particularly strong ability to address Israel and Palestine in a fair and effective manner, and this is why I believe we have no choice but to continue to do so. Thank you.
At times I've been accused of being a slow writer, and I'm afraid the accusation sticks. This particular paper started in 1977, when, as a requirement of my religion class at George School, held in the old meeting house that was once AFSC's headquarters. I was required to do an oral history interview, and I interviewed my father's uncle, Charles Martin, who was a conscientious objector in World War II, Mennonite, and I've been working on it ever since. During the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, the American Friends Service Committee gave voice to the vision of a peaceful relationship between the superpowers. The Service Committee asserted its programmatic witness for nuclear disarmament and against war through publications it produced in response to a world riven by clashing ideologies and alliances. Aiming to engage those in power while mobilizing citizen activism, AFSC publications contributed important ideas and arguments to the international debate. Pamphlets such as Speak Truth to Power, published in 1955, and Anatomy of Anti-Communism, published in 1969, provided analysis and inspiration to grassroots activists striving to be heard. Published more than a decade apart, the two pamphlets elicit three broad questions. How did the authors envision peacemaking for the nuclear age? What prompted the move from accepting containment to critical solidarity with liberation movements? And did their nonviolent approach influence Cold War policy debates? Speak Truth and Anatomy represent three relationships connected to how AFSC confronted the Cold War. Two all-male committees developed policy analyses that reckoned with the applying of nonviolent means to international conflict in the nuclear age. Speak Truth and Anatomy reflect the move from a tacit acceptance of containment of communism to a stance more sympathetic to the ends of national liberation movements, while not endorsing violent means used in prosecuting those struggles. The two pamphlets show the evolution of the progressive era ideas of AFSC as some of its best thinkers tried to translate that legacy for an era when activism drew more from existentialism than from the social gospel. 3 years prior to the publication of Speak Truth, President-elect Dwight Eisenhower explained that in his view, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it is the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religious with all men, and that's in quotes, all men created equal. Eisenhower, of Mennonite heritage, and his vice president, Richard Nixon, of Quaker background, Nixon's uncle, Oscar, served with AFSC in France during the World War I, governed during an era when the assumption that America's Judeo-Christian traditions provided spiritual protection against godless communism held sway. In 1954, Congress had added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in response to lobbying by the Knights of Columbus. At the time of Speak Truth's publication, friend Elton Trueblood served as chief of religious policy for the United States Information Agency and was profiled in Time magazine under the title Truth Salesman. The threat of nuclear war gave new relevance to the nonviolent worldview of pacifists who had lived through World War II. The public consensus that the Second World War had been a just war and that pacifism had proved irrelevant in the fight against fascism received some reconsideration under the threat of nuclear holocaust. The charge of cowardice faced by conscientious objectors and war resistors in the face of conventional war had changed because in a nuclear war, everyone faced being at the front. Speak Truth to Power, a Quaker search for an alternative to violence, appeared at a moment when the role of faithful conscience intertwined with the debate over Cold War foreign policy and the threat of nuclear war. The 14 men who met at Haverford in 1954, convened by AFSC's Stephen Carey, brought a wealth of knowledge and experience to their task. All members of the group had some association with Friends. Several worked for the Service Committee. Senior members of the group included AFSC's Clarence Pickett and A.J. Musty, who had recently retired from the leadership of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. In addition to academic expertise, most were veteran activists. Robert Gilmore served as executive director of the Manhattan office of AFSC. Amia Chakravarti had been an associate of Tagore and Gandhi in India. Milton Mayer and Robert Pickett were friends of Jewish heritage, and Bayard Rustin, a gay African-American Quaker who played a pivotal role in the creation of the document, did not receive acknowledgement in the published product, a result of pressure on Rustin and the committee to erase his contribution due to the fear that public reaction to his 1953 conviction on a morals charge would jeopardize the project. Arranged in 7 chapters, the product of the week-long Haverford Conclave drew upon the insights of the contributors as well as the wisdom of John Woolman, Lucretia Mott, the New Testament, And contemporary thinkers such as George Orwell, Simone Weil, Albert Luthuli, Mohandas Gandhi, and Alan Paton. Truth employed history, the social sciences, and theology to make the case that if the US and the USSR, in pursuit of geopolitical gain, could endanger the planet through nuclear war, then it was more rational for the US to risk disarmament and nonviolent defense than nuclear annihilation. Further, the pursuit of security through permanent military mobilization was already corroding, in the view of the authors, the democratic and spiritual values that the US defense strategy purported to protect. Speak Truth is a statement of faith in the power of nonviolence, bolstered by contemporary examples. Citing Gandhi's application of nonviolence in the struggle for independent India, as well as the 1952 defiance campaign against apartheid in South Africa, led by the African National Congress, Truth made the case that proven and practical models already existed and deserved consideration in the planning of national security. Marshalling arguments for the application of nonviolence to de-escalate the superpower confrontation, Truth called for activism on an individual and global scale, underscored by Gandhi's maxim that the best politics is right action. Speak Truth received wide distribution and comment. Published in the spring of 1955, the pamphlet appeared in abridged form in the October 1955 issue of the Progressive magazine, with commentary and rejoinders from George Kennan, Reinhold Niebuhr, Norman Thomas, Dwight MacDonald, and Carl Menninger. On the magazine's cover, the discussion is introduced as "Is There Another Way?", a memorable debate on the crisis of our time. The editors described Speak Truth as the most significant symposium it has been our privilege to publish in many years. Of the group, only Menninger, the psychiatrist, fully endorsed the study's recommendations. Kennan, while remaining a partisan of military preparedness, asserted that his proposal for containment of the Soviet Union had not thought of the policy as primarily military. Robert Pickett authored the summation of the 72-page original pamphlet under the title "A Revolutionary Approach in the Search for Peace." Into an 8-page article, he and Steve Carey wrote rejoinders as well to the other contributors. Pickett had served in the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, in Sweden and England during World War II. He had studied nonviolence in India and did graduate work in political science at the University of Chicago. He served as peace secretary with the AFSC's Chicago office. Pickett went on to initiate Acts for Peace, with the hope that it would inspire individuals to act as agents of change and move beyond what had become the conventional style of organizing peace-themed educational events. He contended that pacifists should work, quote, not at polarizing, but at permeating the society. When a new wave of peace activism arose in the late 1950s, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy and Committee for Nonviolent Action, well, what started as the Nonviolent Action for Nuclear Weapons and then became the Committee for Nonviolent Action, emphasized demands on both the US and USSR to take steps to end the nuclear arms race. In May 1960, Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut, then chair of the Senate Internal Security Committee, and an advocate of continued nuclear testing, subpoenaed the SANE leadership regarding allegations of communist infiltration. Dodd aimed to force SANE to be openly inhospitable to communists. Conflict caused by Dodd's investigation led to the resignation of key SANE board members, including Robert Gilmore and Clarence Pickett, who had participated in the writing of Truth, as well as Stuart Meacham. The anti-communist political climate created by the congressional investigations and blacklisting of writers, actors, and activists had contained organizing for superpower arms reduction in the early Cold War years. It was in this context that Robert Pickett helped initiate Turn Towards Peace in 1961. Its stated purpose was to be a joint national effort of over 70 organizations working for a disarmed world under law. Staff members included Robert Pickett, initially, and Norman Thomas chaired the Turn Towards Peace. Subsequently, Robert Gilmore held the post. In 1962, author Michael Harrington described Turn Towards Peace as a politically responsible, meaning anti-communist, peace movement for the 1960s. In February 1962, co-sponsorship of a series of student activities in Washington, D.C. called Student Turn Toward Peace enabled Turn Towards Peace to influence the incipient student movement. The actions became famous when, while picketing the White House in blustery weather, the students received an urn of hot chocolate from President Kennedy. Turn Towards Peace was the grand peace movement coalition that was not to be. The AFSC withdrew its support because of the rigid organizational structure imposed to prevent the red-baiting treatment that SANE had suffered. Thus, the effort became largely a supplement to SANE and rather than an independent network. In the wake of the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, Turn Towards Peace mounted voluntary organizations and World Without War conferences in various cities around the country. Disarmament activist Jerome Grossman likened the muted discussion at the New York conclave to a meeting of the Soviet Peace Committee because of the lack of criticism of the US government and the Johnson administration. The organizing strategy promoted by Turn Towards Peace did not survive the upsurge in opposition to the US intervention in Vietnam. In April of 1965, the Students for a Democratic Society organized a large demonstration in Washington, D.C. against the Vietnam War. On the eve of the march, Robert Gilmore, in alliance with Robert Pickett and Bayard Rustin, issued a statement with the endorsement of other peace movement leaders that criticized the policy of non-exclusion of pro-Viet Cong and communist groups from the demonstration. The statement, rooted in the anti-communism of Turn Towards Peace, aggravated the divide between student organizers and their elders in the peace movement. In May of 1965, when war critics gathered for a teach-in at the University of California in Berkeley, Robert Pickett participated as a critic of the new anti-war movement more than an opponent of the war. He opposed the immediate US withdrawal from Vietnam and rejected the more radical analysis presented by Quaker historians Stoughton Lind and others as so much pure crap. Pickett used Turn Towards Peace to legitimize his challenge to the anti-war movement, working to prevent endorsements by SANE of anti-war demonstrations like the March on the Pentagon in October 1967. Subsequently, Pickett reorganized the remnants of Turn Towards Peace into the World Without War Council, while the broader peace movement rejected the cost of containment as shown by the human costs of the war in Vietnam. In 1969, AFSC's Peace Education Division published Anatomy of Anti-Communism. The pamphlet appeared the year that Richard Nixon became president, during a period when AFSC had taken leadership in anti-war protests and helped to organize mass nonviolent demonstrations. Authored by a committee of 8 male academics and activists, including Speak Truth veterans Milton Mayer and Jim Bristol, the report elaborated a vision of American foreign policy that looked beyond the Manichaean dichotomy of the Cold War. The authors argued that reflexive anti-communism had led the US into the Vietnam debacle and allied America to repressive and undemocratic regimes around the world based solely on their opposition to communism rather than whether they supported democracy and human rights. Anatomy moved beyond the tacit acceptance of containment advanced in truth. The 138-page report asserted that the need now is not to stop communism or to go on trying in vain to do so by military means, but to see the good in it as well as the bad and see the failures of capitalism, even of enlightened capitalism, as we now see the good, calling for the US to provide credible moral leadership to match the economic and military prowess. Anatomy declared that if the denial of individual liberty, which we profess so disturbs us about communist government, is really a concern of ours, then we should show a similar concern when non-communist governments reveal a lack of sensitivity toward those who differ politically or racially from those in power. The report advocated bringing economic pressure to bear on repressive nations to move them toward greater freedom. Reiterating the call of the African National Congress and the global movement against apartheid, the AFSC authors called for economic sanctions against South Africa in order to avert what can become the greatest African tragedy of our time. In the tumultuous years between 1955 and 1969, the peace witness of the Service Committee evolved with the changing circumstances of the Cold War. Critic of the AFSC, Gunter Louis, has argued that in this period, AFSC joined the New Left. Given that we are here celebrating the centennial of AFSC and not the 55th anniversary of the founding of Students for a Democratic Society, it might now be said that AFSC helped channel some of the New Left's vibrant energy into work for peace and social change. AFSC's role is what sociologist Alden Morris described as a movement halfway house, training activists and providing the tools necessary to sustain campaigns for social change, including accessible analysis of the threat of war and the things it might make for peace. The phrase "speak truth to power" has morphed into a meme. Derived from Quaker history and deployed by Bayard Rustin, whose name was restored to Speak Truth to Power document in 2012, its origins are unknown to most who employ it today. Its broad usage is similar to the now ubiquitous peace symbol, that dates to the same era. This influence on political culture suggests that despite the continued reliance on militarism in foreign relations, nonviolent activism, as Robert Pickett might have said, can permeate the politics in positive ways. Prompted by the threat of nuclear extinction and engagement with struggles against military intervention, AFSC adapted its progressive era social gospel stance to the existentialist anxiety of the nuclear age. In an era when books such as The Other America, Silent Spring, The Feminine Mystique, and Me Live 4 spurred public debate and policy reform, AFSC's Speak Truth to Power and Anatomy of Anti-Communism shaped education and action for peace. Arguing that war in the nuclear age was both practically and morally obsolete, AFSC reconfigured the case for pacifism for the era of superpower conflict by promoting peace through nonviolence as a way to thaw the Cold War.
Firstly, I'd like to thank AFSC for putting together this symposium and for inviting me. And I want to thank my co-panelists and the moderator and our chair, who, even though she mispronounced my last name, I still forgive her. And for all of you for sitting through a full day and still going to listen to me before the amazing Erica Chenoweth goes on after us. So the title of my paper is From Feminist Security Experts to Democracy Defense Wonks, Middle East Policy and the Politics of Liberal Resistance in the Washington Establishment. And I think I win the award for the longest title of the symposium, which I think it points to the ambitions of my paper, or over-ambitions of my paper. Can you hear me now? Okay. So my dissertation broadly informed this paper, my dissertation research. I focus on this central question in my broader work, which is how and why do certain ideas about security, and you can inverse that, about peace, in the Middle East develop and persist despite becoming failed policies on the ground? Sort of why do we keep falling into the same trap even when we know those previous policies weren't effective? So you may be asking, why is an anthropologist studying this issue? Shouldn't I be studying bones and looking at artifacts and going into tribes in the South Pacific? The answer is yes, there are anthropologists who study those, but we're actually, as a field, moving much more into other areas, including medicine, environmental studies, international relations, and in my case, security studies. I came to Washington in the fall of 2014 to study the ethnography of power in Washington. I did 2 years of participant observation. I conducted 200 interviews. I attended hundreds of events. And I, over many months of gaining trust from the tribe of the policy wonk, as I like to call them, I started to eat their food. I started to dress like them. I stopped looking like a grad student, and I even pretended to become a think tank expert by joining a new think tank that developed in 2014, and even got to be on C-SPAN for a little bit. So through this process of what we call in the social sciences grounded inductive theory, I tried to listen to my interlocutors who are in Washington and try to develop ideas from there. So I didn't go in with a tested hypothesis. And I do want to say at this point, I make no claims of having objectivity here. I'm an Iranian-American young woman. I was perceived in certain ways in these spaces, and I came in with my own biases, but I tried to keep my analytical distance, and I also tried to treat my interlocutors fairly, even when we fundamentally disagreed on core points. So going back to the central question again, how and why do certain ideas about security in the Middle East develop and persist? So I argue that there's two forces at play. There's what anthropologist Joseph Masco calls the counter-terror state, which I'll explain in a minute. And then there are the people who actually enact, who contest, who formulate policy, and that's what we often call publicly or in popular tropes, the establishment. And these forces together formulate Middle East policy as we know it. So what is the counterterror state? The counterterror state was the security state that was produced after 9/11. A lot of its core infrastructure and apparatuses came from the counter-nuclear state, which developed during the Cold War. But what was unique about the counter-terror state was its focus on preemption, right? So the US was going to go out and preempt any possible threat against the homeland. And then what's inherent in that logic is interventionism, it's expansionism. There's almost no end to preemption. And it's always future-oriented, even though you can't predict what's going to happen, right? We all understand that. So built in that is this central paradox, which Joseph Masco, again, this anthropologist, points out to, which is as the US expands to try to secure itself, it actually creates the very conditions of its own insecurity, right? And we're seeing this today with groups like ISIS that formed in the areas of Iraq that we had basically withdrawn from, right? And over the last 16 years, the core targets of the counterterror state have been the people and governments of the Middle East. So on the other side of the equation are the people. And as an anthropologist, I'm interested in the people, right? I'm not interested in the counterterror state as this abstract thing. It's the people who actually create it and reproduce it. And I specifically studied the foreign policy establishment, which is comprised of elected officials, bureaucrats, lobbyists, high-profile journalists, media pundits, top advocacy groups, diplomats, and think tank experts. This group, which I studied like any other social group, like any other anthropologist would study a group, it has its own hierarchies, it has its own rituals, it has its own boundaries. I had to learn all of that. It even has its own language, and that is often recreated by its own experts. And that's why experts are so central to my study, because they're the ones who create the ideas that fuel the counterterror state. And I've met with all of these individuals, and I've met with many more throughout those 2 years of doing fieldwork in Washington. What was surprising for me, and again, this is where the inductive part of my work comes from, what was surprising for me is how often in my interviews with these individuals, they were quick to point out that Middle East policy has failed. They would tell me, yes, Middle East policy has failed, and that would be a starting point for our conversation. And that's something you hear repeatedly when you're in Washington, the failure of this tactic or this strategy or overall Middle East. And whether you're on the left, right, or center, you direct it at, you know, oh, Middle East policies failed because of Bush, or Middle East policies failed because of Obama, or something in between. And so while we were having these conversations about critiquing the foreign policy of the United States, I came to interact with a group of people engaged in what I call liberal resistance within these power structures that I'm describing. So what do I mean by liberal here? It doesn't mean the Democratic Party. A lot of the people involved in liberal resistance are members of the Republican Party and have been lifelong Republicans. It doesn't mean pacifism or non-interventionism. Many of them were quite supportive of various military interventions for various reasons. What it does mean is that they see a comprehensive foreign policy that promotes liberal ideals concerning individual freedom, democracy, human rights, and women's rights specifically. And I know women's rights are human rights, but there's a reason I parse that out specifically. Okay, now what do I mean by resistance? Again, I told you I'm working with, it's not what you think of when you think of resistance, right? It's not people getting arrested in front of the White House. It's people giving really nice speeches at events. Yeah, it's Nancy. It's people writing snarky comments on Twitter. It is people making very pointed critiques at off-the-record White House meetings. Resistance that I'm talking about is incredibly boring. It's very cerebral, and many of you could push back against me and say, this isn't even resistance. But what I do point to is that they are going against some of the core conventional wisdom of the counterterror state, and I'll get into that in the time I have remaining. So one of the groups that I focus on in the paper that's engaged in this liberal resistance are the women, peace, and security movement. And I do want to clarify here, I don't mean the women, peace, and security movement that is global. There is an international WPS movement. I'm talking about the WPS movement as it has been interpreted in the Washington foreign policy establishment. And that's a specific point that is worth noting. This group argues fundamentally that women are good for peace. Women, as a unified category, are forces for counterterrorism. They're nonviolent community organizers. They're social, economic, political stabilizers, and they're a better investment for the US. And I mentioned in the paper that I used to work at the Council on Foreign Relations in the Women in Foreign Policy program, so I was one of these people that was making these arguments, so if I'm critiquing them later, understand that I was a part of this. The problem, the strengths with this movement, of course, is that they're forcing the hardcore security types, the DoD, the Department of Defense types, to rethink military solutions as the only solutions to securing their interests in the Middle East. They've also, because of the nature of where women are situated in a lot of these societies, they're actually making us think about the grassroots much more directly in a way that doesn't typically get discussed in hardcore security circles, right? So when you put an emphasis on women, you tend to talk about more local grassroots initiatives. So this is the great work that this movement is doing in Washington. The problem with this movement is that they tend to only focus on women over there. That's me. Women as a single category. And they fail, in the words of Sally Engle-Mary, who's an anthropologist, to vernacularize the global women's movement into the specific cultures, histories, and political landscapes in which issues of violence take place, right? So it's always about women over there without getting into the specificities of who are these women, what is the specific context that they're in. Are all women peacemakers? Because there's Kurdish women fighters who have picked up arms and are fighting, and there are Palestinian suicide bombers who were women, or there are, that narrative can get very complicated once you get into very specific context. And I don't want to point my finger only at this movement. I would say a lack of regional expertise is actually quite common in the foreign policy community as a whole, and it's actually sometimes encouraged not to have too much regional expertise because it signals that you may have biases or you may have emotional attachments to the people in the region. And then my most serious critique of this movement is that they don't challenge the core logics of the counterterror state, which is that in interview after interview with people who are associated with this movement, they don't challenge the invasion of Iraq. They tell me how supporting women in Iraq can build a stable society. But how can you not talk about how the US invasion marginalized or harmed Iraqis, and within that group, women? So there's this, it might be strategic, it might be because of funding, it might be because of donors, but there is often a reticence to actually criticize the core logics of the counterterror state. And again, it might sound like I'm overstating sometimes, but for the sake of the paper, I'm talking about most of my interviews followed these patterns. The second group that I talk about in the paper that are engaged in this form of liberal resistance is what I'm calling the gender equity movement. And they start from a simple premise, which is, where are the women in the foreign policy community itself? It's an overwhelmingly white male space, as many expert communities are. 28% of the Middle East policy experts I studied in DC are women, and less than 1% are women of color. And within that, most of those are Middle Eastern or people of Asian descent. So the question that the older, and I talk about divisions within the movement, there's older, typically white women who are very powerful. Women like Madeleine Albright, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and others have put their weight behind this to say, why do we not have more women in top foreign policy positions? And they've made very important interventions in this regard, and they've taken on what's called like the all-male panel. I'm sure all of you have heard about this, right? And you can add the all-white male panel. The problem with these older women tends to be the same as the women, peace, and security movement, in that they're trapped in second-wave feminism, as one of my interlocutors said. That is, that women are all the same. You know, whether they're women in Iraq or they're women or they're Madeleine Albright, right? Like we all have the same experience. We're all women, right? And they don't get into the incredible power imbalances that are inherent in that relationship. And they also don't talk about the differences within the experiences of women within the foreign policy community. So I talk to a lot of gay women, women of color, younger women who are really struggling within the foreign policy community in a way that the older white women they don't speak to the same experiences. And so they talk more in terms of feminism as intersectional. And actually, I'll come back to this in the conclusion, they're actually asking really, really interesting questions about if it's always the same group of people making policies, why are we surprised that we keep ending up with the same policies, right? So they're asking the really obvious question. The final group that I talk about is, I'm calling them, for lack of a better term, defense intellectuals for human rights and democracy. And these aren't traditional human rights groups, like Human Rights Watch or Freedom House or any of that. These are security groups that emphasize democracy promotion and human rights. That is, they think US national security is their first priority, and they think that issues such as promoting democracy and protecting human rights in the Middle East are important strategies for securing US long-term interests. As it gets situated within the logics of the counter-terror state, it can be boiled down to fight terrorism, we need to fight political tyranny. And this was a very popular trope during the Bush administration. It's actually been debunked by a lot of scholars. Actually, Erica Chenoweth wrote a review of the literature on the connection between terrorism and democracy, and actually found that before 9/11, terrorism happened more often in democracies and semi-democracies. So the connection was tenuous. After 9/11, we are actually seeing a connection between places that are more tyrannical and the rise of terrorism. I won't get into all of that there. In the paper, I talk about 3 groups that espouse this view. One is the Working Group on Egypt. The other is the Truman National Security Project, and the third is the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The first one is quite bipartisan and has very high-profile members. Truman National Security Project tends to be associated a little bit more with the Democratic Party, and FDD is quite neoconservative, explicitly so, and therefore has typically aligned more with the Republican Party, but have times and issues where they're working on both sides. So the strengths of this movement are that it acknowledges the previous failures of democracy promotion, but continue to push the hardcore security realpolitik type, to take seriously the political aspirations and desires and ideals of the people in the region. They do understand that long-term security requires serious political shifts in the region, and they recognize that the repressive status quo that the US has supported in this region is unsustainable, both on moral and strategic grounds. The limitations of this movement is not only do they fail to challenge the core preemptive and interventionist logics of the counter-terror state, some within the movement actually see democracy and human rights as being advanced by the strategies of military intervention. The second limitation I point to is that, like those in the women, peace, and security movement and some of the older women in the gender equity movement, they have a hard time vernacularizing Western defined notions of human rights and democracy into the local context of the Middle East. So in my last few minutes, before I run out of time, I want to say, I'm going to put the question out here, and I'd actually like to hear your thoughts during the question, but how effective is the liberal resistance movement? And I want to be fair to those within these groups and these movements. They don't claim to be revolutionary. They are reformist. They are choosing to work within the system, and so they can make changes. The overly used cliche in Washington is that policy is a ship, and You can make it veer a little bit from left to right, but you can't fundamentally change the course of the ship. So to be fair, they're not claiming to be revolutionary groups. And I think they are making really important, I would rather some of these groups be there than not be there, because they are pushing the counter-terror state to seriously consider the role of human rights, about democracy and women's rights, both at home and abroad. But are they fundamentally resisting the counter-terror state? The counter-terror state's logics about security are so powerful that they've become truths in Washington, right? So even when we know that interventionism can be problematic, when Assad used chemical weapons a couple weeks ago, interventionism was one of the only options, policy options that was being presented to Trump, right? Military interventionism. So it speaks to just how ingrained some of these truths are and how much even people within it who want to change things, it's hard to change such ingrained truths. The other issue is that this is a social group just like any others, and if you cross the line in certain ways, you don't get invited to come speak. If you cross certain lines, you don't get funding. If you cross certain lines, you're seen as the crazy radical. And if you want to be part of the system, if you want to be able to speak to the power brokers, if you want to speak truth to power, you still have to tone down what you say, otherwise you won't be invited back. And then my last point is that second to last point, I studied the last 2 years of the Obama administration. So I'm very curious what these forces are going to do in an age of Trump, when he has shown little to almost no regard for issues of human rights, women's rights, democracy at home or abroad. So it'll be interesting to see if they actually take on a more active form of resistance from within. And my very, very last point is I have hope in the gender equity movement, in particular of these three groups. The younger, more diverse group of women that I interacted with give me hope, because they're asking really important and really fundamental questions about power and knowledge in the foreign policy community, and they're the ones that give me hope for the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me in the back? Because I was sitting in the back and having trouble. Please put your hands up if you can. My name is Alma Abdul-Hadi Jadallah, and I'm very pleased to be here on the 100th-year anniversary of AFSC. What an honor. And I hope to see you in 200 years. We're going to live longer, right? And then we can see how her work has developed over the year. This is really a little bit awkward. Let me just position myself a little bit well. I'm the International Affairs Representative, the Quaker International Affairs Representative in the Middle East. And maybe at a time you would agree with me that we are looking at unprecedented change. Not only this, I think more than for many of us who have heritage in the region would say something beyond what our parents told us about in 1922, when the map of the current Middle East was drafted, and all these issues of people being moved, displaced, and so on. Of course, I go back and forth between the US and the Middle East, but as you know, the current state is not very promising. We have a lot of social fragmentation. We have the absence of social cohesion among groups. We have people's aspirations have been raised and then they were put down. We have politicized and organized violence by state and non-state actors. We also have an unprecedented migration crisis that really not only breaks your heart, but doesn't allow you to sleep at night. And I'm sure given the crowd that's in the room today, you would agree with me. It's really unbearable to watch, even as people leave certain places after many months of siege, they're being bombed. So in this context, I think today's panel and the last panel and all the panels before that are speaking to our shared responsibility in the face of these unprecedented things that we are observing, also on a national level and internationally, and then how the connection between both of them that we are all working on. Just to give you an example, I just came back from Brussels. There was a big meeting on Syria hosted by the European Union and United Nations office, Special Envoy's office. Syria now has only on the ground 11 million people versus 22 million 7 years ago. So that gives you a perspective on the scale of how many people have been moved other than all the tragedy. I have a lot of comments, and I'm sure you have too, and I'm looking at my time, and we have only 15 minutes. So I will reflect on the papers, at least from the perspective of the Middle East. I'm going to start with the anatomy of truth that David has shared with us, Speak Truth to Power. And I think it's one of the biggest themes that have been actually discussed the whole day because it's fundamental to AFSC interpretation of its Quaker message, not only on a national level, but globally. And it was amazing for me to read that 2 pamphlets resulted in the output, and I really understand why from 1977 you've been working on it. And my comments will not take that many years, but what I was really thinking about is the power of ideas. And I was feeling a sense of sadness because many of the people who have good ideas are in prison, at least in the Middle East. Some of them are still able to write, but you can think of how there is little space for people to come together. And the strength of the Quaker community, from what I know of what we can do, is the power of convening and actually opening that restricted space for people to be able to produce something like this. And so as I was reflecting on your paper, David, I was hoping in my mind that maybe there will be not just 2 pamphlets coming out of the Middle East, but maybe 3 or 4 that can guide the region to move out of this protracted situation that it's in. There was also a lot to be hopeful about because I don't know about you, but I always think I'm a very petite person, and when I travel, I look at the globe, everything looks like very, very small from an airplane. And then you think of these 2 superpowers at competition consistently, you feel a little bit that you don't have much to do. But when you read the paper and you have listened to David's presentation and how the people who actually wrote these powerful ideas and wrote a vision on how to get us during this protracted time gives me hope that we can actually envision something in the future. And so we can be really envisioners of something different. I will go next to the presentation by my colleague Negar. And I'd like to tell her something that was told to me, just not to take too much time, even though she deserves a lot more. She had many ideas in her presentation. Is that if you felt dismissed right now, I will give you advice, because it was given to me when I did my doctorate, that if you finish your doctorate and people don't like what you say, they will still have to respect you for what you did in the research. And so she really touched on something quite important, is how we, for those of us who live in the Washington metropolitan area, and particularly, I'll just focus on the women's issue, and she called it the counter-state and the issue of securitization, and that discourse, how much it is closed, not just for women, but women of color, women from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and how there has been a high cost for that sense of exclusion. But also more importantly, and I think you would agree with me, that even ideas coming from the outside to feed into that discourse are being blocked. So you have it being blocked internally and externally. The antennas are down. They're not receiving even contributions from the outside. And I think that's something for us to be thinking about. I'm also concerned that David Kuhn had always said that when things fail, there is a paradigm shift. But it looks like in Washington, there's a lot of resistance. No paradigm shift is happening, and more Orientalism where we needed to project on the others. I'll move a little bit faster just so I can give you time to have more comments to our colleagues and their excellent ideas. I'd like to move to Stephan's paper, which triggered a lot of thought in my mind. I heard from him a couple of things that I hope you would agree with me. He seemed to kind of say, hey, listen, I am an insider and an outsider. I was in the discourse around what should be done, and I was met with a lot of resistance. And I am now bringing the conversation forward, but the context has changed. And I'd also like to get us out of this protracted discussion around Israel and Palestine, and I'd like to present you with some ideas. He also made a very good point around BDS being a tactic versus something that is you know, it's a party to the conflict. It's actually a tactic that is used. And he tried to talk to us about the issue of balance and sensitivity. And there was one thing that really stood out to me, which I think the Quakers have taken a high risk on, and I agree with you, maybe a bit polarizing for all of us, that when it comes to Israel and Palestine, you can get in trouble. No matter what you do, you get into trouble. And it seemed to me he had a lot of courage. But I had to stop a couple of times when I was reading his paper, particularly around the analogy, and when you get a copy, it was on page 6, around whether if there was African Americans who wanted to have a, what he called a black state in the world. And I had to stop and say, how would I comment on this? It triggered a lot of emotions in me if I would be denying someone a need to meet a basic need for their identity. And then I reconciled with myself and I thought, you know, I'll go to the title of our presentation, Speak Truth to Power. And so it's not really about who's black or white, Jewish or red or green or blue. It's really whether you stand on the principle, and then that would resolve many issues. So on this note, I'm going to open for a Q&A. I took a little bit more than I expected from your time. And my guess is maybe with the assistance of my colleagues with the microphone, and we thank you, we would go maybe you know, across the room. So we'll take one question from here, one from here, and one from here, and one from there. If we have enough, we'll come back in that direction. Any question from this side of the room? No questions? One question over here. Yeah, could you please?
Oh, okay. The Hague just ruled against Monsanto and said that it had met the standard. We all agreed that they had met the standard of that that it was an international, that it was against humanity, that it was against. That it was corporate manipulation, all sorts of different things that they ruled. Also, they were talking about ecocide and that it could very well be considered an issue of international importance. And they were recommending that they go before the United Nations and take Monsanto as an example, but other multinational corporations also as examples of being against humanity, against life, against the environment. And I'm probably not expressing it very well, and I'm wondering what your response to that is, what you think that that will produce.
Who would like to try? Stephen or David? I don't know.
Refer to Speak Truth to Power. That's a broad question, but let me report that as of yesterday, when you do a Google search on Speak Truth to Power, you learn about the new film about the Armenian genocide, union organizing, and a high school video contest. So we have to keep speaking truth to power.
Okay, other comments, please, over here. It's you, ma'am. Yeah, thank you.
Can you comment about the influence or permeation at all of the AFSC, FCNL shared security analysis? Are you familiar with it at all?
Stephen, would you like? No?
Yeah, so just at USIP, we're certainly familiar with it. This was part of our Oh, dear. Yeah.
Just get close.
Yeah, just get closer.
This was part of the impetus of the partnership between USIP and AFSC was around the shared security agenda. And one of the main reasons we wanted to do the online course together was to highlight the history of Quaker peacemaking and nonviolent resistance within the framework of the shared security. So I wouldn't be able to, I don't know how much it's permeated on the Hill or with state and aid colleagues, but certainly the reframing of security, the human security paradigm is much more popular than it was even a few years ago. So, so I think there are aspects of it that are certainly catching on.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, sir. Could we have the mic here, please? It's over here. Over here. Beth, I think they're relying on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I sit on the International Programs Executive Committee, Middle East Subcommittee, and the advice and counsel offered by this panel will be most helpful. The question that I have is actually on the analysis of resistance in Washington. You left out one group which has been steadfast in its criticisms of intervention, and it would actually be the realists on very, very different grounds. But you look to Kelly Greenhill at Tufts, or Mearsheimer, Walt, Posen, and others, and they've actually been probably among the foremost critics of intervention as a major tool of counterterrorism. Could you comment on this weirdness of hardcore realists being maybe the most steadfast critics of the policies that we in fact find distasteful?
Thank you for that question. I specifically changed the title of my paper to Liberal Resistance for that reason. I wanted to talk about those who are critiquing the counter-terror state with the language of feminism, with the language of democracy and human rights. But there are absolutely realists who are making very convincing arguments about non-interventionism. And ironically, the place that I consistently encountered the non-interventionist discourse was at the Cato Institute. The libertarians are bringing in the Mearsheimers and others to come and talk about the dangers of overextension. I just didn't have the space or time to talk about it in this paper, but yes, absolutely.
I'd just quickly add that I first noticed this, of course, during the Bush administration and now under Trump, that when you have the realists, when you have the State Department, when you have the Pentagon professionals, when you have the CIA as the rational actors in the equation, you know we're in trouble. And you know, while it's good to have allies, even in the mainstream, I think we really need to still be careful. I mean, you know, Mearsheimer and Walt have had some very important and good critiques of U.S. Middle East policy, but instead of questioning the whole military-industrial complex, instead of having thoughtful critiques of U.S. imperialism, instead they blame the Israel lobby. And I'm not, as someone who's been a target quite frequently of what we often call the Israel lobby, and have had my talks canceled, and I'm on the list of the 12 most dangerous Middle East, most dangerous anti-Israel Middle East professors and all that kind of stuff. I'm not denying that there doesn't exist this kind of right-wing Zionist lobby. But frankly, this kind of exaggeration of their influence, I think, does frankly borderline anti-Semitism in terms of blaming the Jews instead of the people who really have the power in this country, who tend not to be Jewish. In fact, there are a lot more Episcopalians and Presbyterians in high positions of power in the national security establishment than there are Jews, and proportionally, they're actually a smaller percentage of the population than there are Jews. So, I just mention this only because I think that a lot of the, well, again, it's good to have allies where we can get them. Let's make sure they do not dominate the discourse, and let's be sure that we are there to put forward our analysis, which is to critique militarism, critique imperialism, and critique patriarchy, critique the real roots of this dangerous foreign policy.